There we go. Okay, everybody, welcome to yet another Nova Scribes. I'm very pleased to introduce you all to Joe Gerstandt. He has been a mentor and a sage of mine for a long time on the topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we thought, just given the state of the state and how DEI can be a dirty word, that it'd be a good time to double down on it. So I invited him to come to Nova Scribes and share a little bit of his message with us. Just to let you know who he is a speaker, an author, an advisor. He brings clarity, action, and impact to organizational diversity and inclusion efforts. He has been a strong advocate for resetting the diversity and inclusion conversation. He sees diversity and inclusion as poorly understood and often misunderstood. His keynote messages and interactive workshops bring greater clarity, action, and impact to existing and new organizational diversity and inclusion efforts. And Joe, it's great to have you at Nova Scribes. What have you got for us?
It's great to be here. Thanks, Brian, and thanks everyone else for showing up. I'm delighted to be a part of this conversation tonight. I'm calling in from Omaha, Nebraska, which is cold and gray. I hope it's less cold and less gray wherever you're at today. And I hope that this is a valuable conversation for everybody. I'm not entirely sure how to tackle this conversation because it's a wild time to just be having conversations about DEI. And I even was kind of conflicted about the name that we came up with, Doubling Down, because, well, I think we do need to double down. It's also a very real thing that some people work in organizations and situations where they're not even allowed to use the words, some of the words that we're going to use tonight. So I think doubling down can look different depending on the context. But I'm going to start tonight by talking a little bit about language. I'm going to start kind of on a strategic level, and then I'm going to get to a more tactical level. And please feel free at any time to jump in with questions, comments, or complaints. We can be as interactive as you like. I have kind of a plan in mind, but we can go wherever we need to go. I want this to be as valuable for you as possible. I'm going to go ahead and put my slides up. And I put in the chat feature, I put my email address, and I also mentioned the fact that I will be sharing these slides, whatever the easiest way to do that is. I can send them to Brian and he can distribute them, but these slides will be available. I do use probably too many slides, and I put a lot of resources in my slides, so sometimes folks like to have them to go back and reflect on. As Brian mentioned, I think there's a lot of confusion about this work. I mean, there was confusion about this work 5 years ago. Since then, there's been a tremendous amount of misinformation and disinformation, just outright lies spread about this work. So I think that while language and definitions and logic don't seem like exciting aspects of this work, I think they're actually incredibly important aspects of this work. If we would have done a better job, I'm not putting the current situation on us as people that support or involved in DEI, but I think if we would have done a better job of telling our story, of taking care of our language, I don't think we would probably be in quite the same situation. There's been a profound amount of confusion. Even today, when I hear people in the media, on TV, on the news, on social media, talking about DEI, even the people that are pro DEI or position themselves that way, they're talking about things that simply aren't true of DEI. Even they've bought into some of the kind of propaganda and the misinformation out there. So I think that language, if you're in a situation where you can actually use these words, I think they can actually be an incredibly powerful tool for you. This is a quote that's kind of been stuck in my head since I first read it. The Heath brothers have written some fantastic books. In one of their books, I think it was in Switch, you can find this particular line: "What looks like resistance is often a lack of clarity." And I think that's very true, and I think it's especially true of this work. I think there's a lot of confusion and a huge lack of clarity in most organizations. Most organizations, even organizations that say big, beautiful things about diversity and equity and inclusion, can't tell you in simple words what those things are. They're quick to tell you how inclusive they are. They can't tell you what that means in a way that makes any sense. That's true of organizations. It's also true of leaders. So I think that if you're able to use these words in the organization that you work in the meetings that you're a part of, you can use them in a very strategic and intentional way. You can make sure that you're operating with a common language. And I think that almost never happens when it comes to DEI. Even people that are kind of in agreement about DEI being a good thing, if you ask them what diversity is, if you ask them what inclusion is, if you ask them what equity is, you're going to get a bunch of different answers. Some of those answers will be very different from each other. And We don't all have to use these words the same way, but for a particular context, for an organization or for an event, to have a common language, it's pretty important that we put some clear and concise definitions in place. And in my experience, I've been self-employed as an external consultant doing DEI work for almost 20 years. I've been involved in this work in total for 25 years. I've worked with a lot of different kinds of organizations. I rarely find organizations that have clear, concise definitions in place for this work. And if they do have clear and concise definitions, they don't actually use them. They have like an actual logical narrative of what this work is and why it's important to them, but then they go and do the same things that every other organization does. They start a bunch of ERGs. And not that ERGs are necessarily a bad thing, but they're not, in most organizations, they're not a terribly effective thing for driving actual change. But we just kind of roll out the same programs at organizations, and we should see more variation in that. If you're able to use these words and put a common language in place, I think these are some of the reasons why that is important. I think organizations and leaders need to have locally relevant, honest, actionable, safe, logical conversations about this work. And I think that becomes a lot more likely when you have that common language, when you're actually using these words in the same way. Again, oftentimes not the case. And I used to collect these, but I stopped because it just got kind of too depressing. But I used to collect corporate definitions. And this is what a corporation says about diversity. And I apologize for this, but I'm actually going to read this to you. The concept of diversity encompasses acceptance and respect. It means understanding that each individual is unique and recognizing our individual differences. These can be along the dimensions of race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, age, physical abilities, religious beliefs, political beliefs, or other ideologies. It is the exploration of these differences in a safe, positive, and nurturing environment. It is about understanding each other and moving beyond simple tolerance to embracing and celebrating the rich dimensions of diversity contained within each individual. Now, I love some of the words that are on this slide. That reading this gives me a little bit of a hippie buzz. I have no idea what this means. And I'm a person who cares about this stuff and thinks about this stuff. Like, this is not a definition. This is some nice feel-good stuff. It's not a definition. And for the 35-year-old cisgender straight white guy that works in accounting in your organization that is already convinced this work isn't serious or doesn't have anything to do with him, like, this particular definition doesn't change that. It doesn't help that. And I see organizations. Most of my clients have been medium to large organizations, but I've also worked with nonprofits. I've worked with government entities. Most organizations, if they have some kind of foundational language in place, it's stuff like this. It's warm, fuzzy stuff. Like, I can't even tell if they're telling me it's a verb or a noun on this slide. Like, this, it makes me feel good for a second reading it. It's not helpful at all. And I don't think it helps identify what kinds of projects we should invest in. I think, and it's hard. It's hard to get these definitions in place. I've worked with a lot of organizations to put their foundational definitions in place. And like, we have for people that care about this work, we have a really strong desire to say all of the good things about all of these words. And so it's hard to have clear and concise definitions, but these are a few things that will be helpful. The kind of the moral of this story for this slide, if you haven't picked up on it yet, is just tell me what it is. Just tell me what it is. Don't tell me how you feel about it. Don't tell me why you care about it. We can get to that stuff later on down the road. When you use the word diversity or inclusion, tell me specifically what you mean. If we can get to that point, that definition becomes a very valuable thing in a bunch of different ways. I think those definitions should be clear and concise. I think they should be logical. Like, does it make sense? Can we tell them apart? A lot of times that's not the case. You could kind of interchange definitions of diversity and inclusion for each other. We should be able to tell them apart. I should know whether it's a noun or a verb, whether it's a thing we do, it's a thing we have, it's a thing we want, and they should be useful. Like, do these definitions help us have more actionable, meaningful, logical conversations? Do they help us figure out what success looks like? And again, we don't all have to use the same definitions. I'll share some definitions with you tonight just to kind of prime your own thinking. The larger point is that I think organizations, if they're going to do this work, need clear definitions in place. If you're going to have a meaningful interaction, I think having those clear definitions in place is very important. When I use the word diversity, I mean the same exact thing every single time I say it. When I use the word diversity, what I mean is difference. That's what the dictionary tells me the word means. When I use it, I'm talking about difference. I'm not using it to identify certain groups or members of certain groups. And that's the way that the word is used in most organizations. I think that's inaccurate. I think it's illogical. I think it's problematic. When I use the word diversity, I'm talking about difference. And there's some important things I think to understand about difference. And I'm going to walk through this with you just to give you a sense of how using very intentional definitions can help your approach to this work. I think diversity is a good example. So the way that I use it is it means difference, and it's really important to understand that difference is a relational thing. Difference doesn't exist in people, it exists between people, right? You have to be different from somebody else. The relationship is inherent or implied. But that's not the way that the word is used in most organizations. And you've probably seen that with your own experience. If we look at this picture of these two former coworkers, most people's way of thinking and talking about diversity would lead them to say that it is the freakishly talented Dr. Rice that is the diverse one in this picture. You've probably heard we have a diverse candidate coming into interview today. You probably have some idea what that means. I think that's an inaccurate and illogical way to use the word, and I also think it's problematic. If we look at these two people, neither of whom we know, at least I don't know these two people, I'm probably not ever going to know them, but if we look at these two people and we frame or label or identify one of them as the diverse or different person, we are also labeling the other person as the normal one. And I think regardless of the intentions involved, there are profound consequences to that. I think how we use these words and why we use them the way that we do matters greatly. And I don't think we've paid enough attention to that part of the work. We've been busy launching projects and programs. We haven't made sure that there's a clear, strong foundation of language and logic underneath, that we're using these words in intentional ways. There's differences or diversity between people, and there's differences between all people, right? This is something that shows up in everything involving two or more human beings. A friendship, a family, a neighborhood, all of those things have diversity inside of them. Diversity means difference. It's a relational thing. It exists between people. It also takes many different forms. And I don't know if I'm very good at making this point or these 2 points, because they kind of conflict with each other. But I think there's an opportunity for us to bring more kinds of difference into the conversation. At the same time, I don't think we can let ourselves be convinced that we don't have to focus a lot of our effort on race anymore, or we don't have to focus a lot on gender or the trans community. There's a lot of evidence that we have a lot of work still to do there. I think that's very true. I also think at the same time, we have an opportunity to bring more kinds of difference into the conversation. One of the models that I use for just helping people think about this a little bit is just a model of social identity. We all have a social identity. My social identity is how I see myself and how the world sees me. And our identities are made out of a whole bunch of different stuff. One of the reasons why there's difference between all human beings is that, for better or worse, each of us has our own delightful, unique, one-of-a-kind personality. Around that are what are usually referred to as primary or internal aspects of identity. These are aspects of who I am. They may be really important to me or not so important to me, but they're largely determined or framed to some extent at birth. These things don't change very easily. They're fairly static. Around that are what is usually referred to as secondary or external aspects of identity. These are things that also might be really important to me or not important, but these are more about life experience and choices that we've made. Some of you can relate to my experience. There was a point in my life where I said out loud and in public that I would never be caught dead driving a minivan. And I meant it. I was dead serious. It made no sense to me at all. Fast forward a few years from that point, not only was I driving a minivan, but I loved our minivan. Toyota Sienna. It was a game changer. Power sliding doors on both sides. When you have kids, a minivan starts to make a whole bunch of sense to you, right? Some aspects of our identity are fairly static and don't involve a lot of choice. Some aspects of our identity are fairly fluid and do involve choice. And one of the things to keep in mind about that is that as we go through life and our identity naturally evolves and changes, so do our priorities and our perspectives on things. A Mustang convertible means something at 20 that it doesn't mean at 55. And the same thing is true of a minivan. This work is complex, Not only because we're all different from each other, and all 8 billion of us are in fact different from each other, but we're all also moving projects. Like I'm a different person now than I was 10 years ago. I'm a different person now than I was Monday morning. Like Monday morning me and Friday afternoon me are kind of two different people. And around that are aspects of identity that are specific to work, which usually don't even get mentioned in this work, but they're the same kinds of things. They're kinds of difference. They're ways that difference can show up in a relationship or part of a group. So again, I think we can I think we can look for opportunities to bring more of these kinds of difference into our conversations. I also think it's pretty important that we keep these things in front of us because these are the things that don't involve a lot of choice. These are things that tend to send strong visual cues, which is by far the biggest driver of bias. These are also things that have some of the most negative consequences inside and outside of the workplace. So I think it's important to keep our eyes on this and to not to venture off into those outer rings too much where the conversations for some people get a lot more comfortable. I think just the fact that some of these conversations about the things on this screen are uncomfortable for us is evidence that we need to keep going back in there. We need to keep doing that work and figuring that out. Diversity means difference. It's a relational thing. It takes many different forms. It's also naturally disruptive. Diversity is a social catalyst. If you add diversity to a group, whether it's a family or a neighborhood or an organization, you're going to change that group in some way. And there are people in the world that will tell you diversity is a bad thing and it always makes things worse. And there are people that will tell you diversity is a good thing and it always makes things better. And each of those people will point to their examples. The underlying reality of what diversity does is it makes things different. If you add diversity to a group or pay more attention to existing diversity, things are going to get better or they're going to get worse. There's 40 plus years of research behind this. Groups with greater diversity overperform and underperform groups with less diversity consistently. And this is a really important point to understand about diversity because we get spent in a lot of organizations, we get stuck in this cycle of arguing about whether diversity is a good thing or a bad thing. That whole conversation, I think, is a waste of time. And we'll talk a little bit later if we get to it about polarity management. But I think that conversation is a complete waste of time. Diversity is a natural thing. Regardless of how you feel about it, it exists. In every interaction you have with another human being, in every relationship you have, in every group you're a part of, diversity exists. Whether we want the good outcome or the bad outcome is kind of important for us to think about so that we can put it in the right kind of container, because that's what makes the difference. The container that we put the diversity into, the environment, the culture that we put that diversity into. If you put more diversity into a place that doesn't actually value diversity, and I would say that's what a lot of organizations have done. If you put more diversity into a place that believes in ignoring or denying differences, that avoids conflict or does it poorly, where there's lots of unwritten rules, those are the organizations, teams, and departments that as they get more diverse, things like satisfaction, turnover, and performance all tend to suffer. And usually those outcomes get blamed on the diversity. If you put that same mix of ingredients in a different kind of container, one that does value differences, that sees difference as a source of value, one that doesn't have unwritten rules, that does relationship building and conflict well, those are the teams and organizations and departments that as they get more diverse, they outperform everyone else. So again, I don't think there's any value in us getting bogged down in a debate about is diversity a good thing or a bad thing. That's kind of like, is gravity a good thing or a bad thing? Gravity doesn't care. It just keeps having its effect on the world. Regardless of how you feel about gravity, pushing a boulder up the side of a mountain is a profoundly different experience than pushing the same boulder down the same side of the same mountain, right? Diversity doesn't care how you feel about it. It affects us though. And so we should keep that in mind and we should try to put it in the right kind of container so that we want those better outcomes. We want better individual and team outcomes, especially. And we also know there's a great deal of research that connects diversity and psychological safety. Maybe we'll get into that a little bit today. If you want to build smart teams, that's what it's about. It's not about grouping smart individuals together, which is still what most organizations do. It's about bringing people together that carry different information and different perspectives and different experiences and putting them in a container where they can actually tell the truth to each other, where they can share those differences. We also know that this work has pretty strong impacts on the individual experience. We know from brain science and other fields that if a human being spends 6 or 7 or 8 hours a day feeling welcome, feeling like they belong, feeling like an insider, feeling like they're included, we know that we get a different version of them than if they spend those same 6 or 7 or 8 hours feeling excluded, feeling like an outsider. We know that their brain actually functions differently in those two environments. And there's probably a lot of organizations that have a lot of their employees spending most of their day in fight or flight mode. And that is not the best version of them. That's not the most creative version of them. That's not a risk-taking version of them. That's not a navigating conflict well version of them. If we want the best version of the people around us, that container is pretty important. And you all play kind of, in some of your work, you get to play kind of a unique role in creating a container for specific experiences or specific conversations. So kind of to one way of thinking about diversity is about the mix of ingredients that you have access to, the mix of identities and perspectives and experiences. The work of inclusion is about putting that stuff in the right kind of container. Is it a strong container? Is it an intentional container? Is it a container that actually sees difference as a source of value? And I think one of the very best questions you can ask about that container, whether you're talking about your organizational culture or you're talking about a team or you're talking about a particular conversation or meeting, is can we tell the truth to each other here? Can we tell the truth to each other? That's pretty central to this idea of inclusion. It doesn't really matter how different we are if we can't actually share that, if we can't actually own that and share our differences with each other. And in my experience, most organizations and most teams have some room for improvement when it comes to telling the truth to each other. And I'm not suggesting that they go to work and tell a bunch of lies. I don't think that happens in too many places, but they avoid all of the difficult, the risky truths. And I think there's a lot of information and potential lost there. So going back to having some clear and concise definitions, these are, if you're going to put definitions in place, these are kind of the things that I would keep going back to. Is it clear and concise? Is it logical? Is it useful? And again, this is kind of hard to do because people want to say all of their favorite things about these words. The clear and concise thing, the logical thing, both of those are hard to get to. I'm going to share a set of definitions. This is a company that I worked with a couple of years ago who wanted to begin by putting some foundational language and logic in place. And these are the definitions that they came up with for diversity, inclusion, belonging, and equity. And I think this is a pretty decent set of definitions. I think they're fairly clear and concise. I think they're logical. And I know that at least initially they were useful. This isn't a client I've caught up with recently, but I know at least initially they were useful. Let me pause there and just see if you have any responses to anything that I've said so far or to this particular definitions. We're not going to spend too much more time on language, but I wanted to at least cover that because I think it's an underutilized tool.
So if you got something to share, just feel free to go ahead and go off mute and give it a voice.
Oops. Let me take a look in the chat feature real quick.
I think there's a lot of echoing of your sentiments in chat, Joe.
I have a Suburban. Yep. The paradox of diversity. People are all alike and all different. Absolutely. So this is a sample set of definitions, and then the next really important thing is to use these definitions. To use these definitions in choosing what to do. That's how you have a logical approach to this work. And again, a lot of organizations don't have that. I apologize. I probably said that too many times. I think there's a few general kinds of targets you can identify for things that you want to change. Experiential targets. I think that stuff is overlooked. We don't do things to measure the employee experience, and we're not intentional about delivering a certain kind of employee experience. A lot of DEI targets are focused on employee outcomes, and some are focused on demographic targets. And then you can select tactics to chase that target. A few big examples are we going to achieve this target by changing employee behaviors, by changing leadership behaviors, by changing or implementing programs or policies? I think if your definitions and your targets and your tactics are all aligned and logically connected, I think you have a beautiful thing that almost no organizations have. And I think it's a whole lot harder for people to be against that and to not support it. That's one of the reasons why I think having a common language in place is. And then another valuable piece of it, and this applies to meetings and organizations and teams, is to put some specific signs and signals in place. Based on the definitions that I just shared with you, these are kind of the core 4 signals that we put in place on the team level. So team leaders at the organization that I shared the definitions of are responsible for these things. These things are measured, they're set as expectations, they're behavioral expectations, and they're measured. Do we do a good job here of telling the truth? Do we have the ability to have healthy conflict? Both of those things are central to this. Disagreement is kind of the best proxy there is for diversity. And disagreement is one of the ways that diversity manifests itself in the world. Done well, disagreement is really, really valuable. But it's also hard work, and most teams don't know how to do it well. But it's pretty central to this work. Can we tell the truth to each other? Can we disagree with each other? Can I disagree with my boss? Can I ask for help? Can I admit failure? Do we have the ability to have healthy conflict? Do we have some camaraderie and some curiosity? Do we get to know each other beyond our work experience? And when we're together as a team, do we have some shared airtime and influence, or does the same person always make the decisions and the same 3 people dominate the conversation? This gives you, I think, a much stronger and a much more logical kind of foundation to operate on. Regardless of how you define inclusion or this work, I think one of the important things to keep in mind and to remind other people of is that it is activist in nature. It's not enough to have good intentions. Like, good intentions have got us to where we are today. Good intentions are not enough. They're better than bad intentions, but good intentions are not enough. If you want to be inclusive as a person, a facilitator, a leader, an organization, you have to be able to also say, and these are the things that I do intentionally, deliberately, and proactively to be more inclusive, to provide a more inclusive experience for the folks around you, to build that very specific and strong container. And I'll give you an example that might be useful for some of you folks as facilitators. We'll maybe get to psychological safety to make sure that everyone has kind of a basic understanding of that if we have enough time. But psychological safety, just kind of a crash course on it, is, when we come together as a group, and I think it's most effective to think about it on the group level or the team level rather than the organizational level. That gets too big and abstract. But psychological safety means that when we come together as a group, I feel safe taking some risks and being vulnerable. That's kind of a simple definition of what psychological safety is. And these are some things that kind of take away from someone's psychological safety. So as a facilitator who's thinking about facilitating an experience, facilitating a conversation, these are some things to be on the lookout for and to look for opportunities to design against them, right? Being interrupted happens all the time. And some of you are probably super skilled at managing that. Being the only one of your identity or demographic or social group, groupthink, tone policing. These are all things that can very easily take away psychological safety from some people in the group or in the conversation. So look for some opportunities to build that strong intentional container. If I know that being interrupted is going to be a problem, what's my solution for that? Do I have some skills? Do I have some ground rules I'm going to put in place? If this is a group that gets stuck in a lot of groupthink, what am I going to do to break them out of that in a safe way? And like I said, we'll maybe come back to psychological safety and unpack that a little bit further and talk about some examples of ground rules or agreements that have been really valuable for me. Another tool that I just want to share with you as facilitators, and some of you are probably familiar with this, some of you probably know more about this than I do, but it is polarity management. And there's a fair amount of information about this out there online, but it is kind of an intentional approach for a conversation to avoid framing something as a good thing or a bad thing and considering it as one of the poles on a continuum. So rather than, for example, thinking about, do we think diversity is a good thing or a bad thing, talking about how diversity is on one end of the continuum and commonality or likeness is on the other end of the continuum. And they both have positive things and they probably both have negative things. Sometimes that can be a more valuable way to have a conversation than just an open conversation about diversity. So trying to get us away from and or thinking. These are some examples of polarities. Patience and urgency, right? Both of those things are important, can be really important, but too much of them can probably be a bad thing. The same thing with efficiency and inclusion, right? The more people you include, the more information you include in something, the slower and less efficient it becomes, all the way down to the bottom, differences and commonalities. So sometimes, in my experience, this can be a much more valuable way to have conversations with groups about some of these issues, so that we're not all stuck in our for or against camp and we're exploring the issue in a different way. And a lot of times when I'm using this, what I will do is I'll identify one of those polarities. Say we're going to talk about difference versus commonality. First, we start by saying, what are the upsides or the pros of differences or diversity? What would be some things that you would say in response to that question? You can come off mute or you can put them into the chat feature. What would be some downsides to differences or diversity? Or we can sit in awkward silence.
It's a lot to process, Joe. Give people a second to gather their
Okay.
thoughts. I would say that one of the downsides to diversity is that it, as you said, it does introduce difference. And that can be slow. If you have a group of people that are all thinking the same way, that they have similar backgrounds, then you do have groupthink, but you also tend to move a little bit quicker.
Yep.
Diversity can slow things down.
Absolutely, it does. A lot of important things slow things down, and we don't have a lot of workplaces that really value that. But it does slow things down. It's not the most efficient route. And this is, again, a reminder that this work is activist, and you do have to be intentional, because even if you intellectually believe in the importance of diversity, the reality is that today's meeting is going to be a little bit simpler and easier and softer for you if we just all pretend like we think the same thing. We don't think the same thing, but a lot of times we pretend like we do. But anyway, using this particular slide, you can identify what some of the upsides of differences are, and there's a bunch of upsides. You can talk about what some of the upsides of commonality or sameness are, and there's a bunch of upsides there too. And there's also downsides of both. Neither one of these things are like all good or all bad. They can all be taken too far. And so the next step is to think about what are some early warning signs. Like if we feel like we're getting too groupthinky, what are some indicators of that? And then action steps, what are we going to do about that? If we feel like we're not groupthinky enough and we're all over the place and everyone's got their own opinion and we're never going to make any progress, what are the indicators of that? And what are we going to do when that happens to move us back into the right relationship with both of these things, balancing both of these things, diversity and sameness. On the team level, both of those things are very important. Diversity adds information and experience to the team, and the sameness allows us to have some efficiency and to actually communicate and work together. But then beyond that, I think especially for facilitators, another way that you can think about using these polarities is in thinking about, oh, this is going to sound really woo-woo, but thinking about how you manage the energy or the vibrations of the group. I'm sorry if I sound super hippie right now. I don't know what a better word is, but I'll explain this diagram that I've got in front of you, and then I think you'll understand what I'm failing to communicate. This is not my tool. This was a tool developed by a genius woman, Glenda Ouyang, with the Human Systems Dynamics Institute, which I don't believe is actually a thing anymore, unfortunately. But it's a roadmap for facilitating group conversations, and really it's more of a roadmap for managing group energy, and it's looking at two different variables: high difference and low difference. Or excuse me, one variable is difference, high difference or low difference. That means we're differing from each other, we're disagreeing with each other, or we're not. And the other variable is exchange. High exchange means like we're actually together, communicating directly with each other. Low exchange means we're probably spread out in different places, different offices. If we are communicating, it's over email. It's just about the amount of communication or exchange. And then based on these two variables, we can think about what each of these quadrants is really good for. So high difference, high exchange, that's where a lot of innovation comes from. Learning, growth, self-organization. But it's also true that it's hard work. Like for some of us, disagreeing with people at work is one of the most emotionally taxing things that we do. It's stressful, conflict is hard, it's exhausting. So this quadrant, like all of the other quadrants, we don't want to just stay there. There's reasons to go there, but we only want to go there when we have to. There's pros and cons. High exchange, high difference. High exchange, low difference is probably a little bit of what you all do when you come together in your meetings. You're a group, you're a community of practice. You've got a lot of things in common. Maybe you don't have a lot of big differences, but you're actually interacting directly with each other. That quadrant's really good for celebrating, reinforcing energy, but too much time there can be poorly spent time. Low exchange, high difference. This is like maybe we're coworkers, and tomorrow we're going to have an offsite meeting together, but we're not together right now. And it's safe, but it's also a time of, there's a lot of misunderstanding. We're a little bit isolated. There's maybe rumors going around about what's going on tomorrow. And then low difference, low exchange, comfort, belonging, rest, and recovery. Apparently, if you stay there too long, you can die. That seems a little bit extreme, but it's not my model, so I don't feel safe removing it. But this gives you kind of a roadmap for thinking about this group that I'm a part of, this conversation that I'm facilitating right now. What quadrant do they really need to be in? And is that the quadrant that they're in right now? I think if you've had a little bit of facilitation experience, you can probably identify and put groups in these quadrants pretty easily. And if you've been a part of, an ongoing working team, I think you've probably seen the reality that most teams kind of bounce back and forth between a couple of these places. For example, high difference, high exchange, like not all teams have the ability to do that well. They just don't. We haven't done a good job of helping people how to understand doing disagreement well. A lot of teams don't ever get to that quadrant. But we can look at this and we can use this as a tool for kind of assessing where the group is right now and comparing that to where they need to be. And then I can also think about, like, what tools can I use to move them to a different quadrant? If they're in the upper right-hand quadrant and it's time to go to the lower left-hand quadrant, like how do I make that happen as a facilitator? And I apologize to those of you professional facilitators that this might be super, super basic. I apologize for that. But it's been a really effective tool for me. So if I'm in the upper left-hand corner, high difference, high exchange, like we're together and we've been fighting. We've been talking about stuff that matters, vision, values, those kinds of things. But we've done that work and we want to move to a different quadrant. These are some examples of things that we can do. Tell a joke. I put an asterisk by that one. Be very careful with humor in this quadrant because emotions are high and things can be easily misinterpreted. I think the right joke at the right time is golden, but the wrong joke at the wrong time can also be a train wreck. So maybe don't put that at the top of the list, but go back to shared values. Invite people to share personal experiences or personal stories. That's one of the things that I almost always use. When a group has been divided and fighting over some stuff and I'm ready to bring them back together, I give them an opportunity to share stories about things like why they got into this work or why they joined this organization. Like those stories always bring commonalities back to the surface. And that's kind of what we're doing with this move. Or we can pick a different topic, a topic that we know the group is pretty much kind of on the same side on. All of those things are examples of ways I move from high difference to low difference. If I'm over here in low difference and I want to move down to low difference and low exchange, those are some things I can do. Moving from low difference to high difference, that's probably a really important toolkit. I think teams oftentimes just aren't good about that. Amplify differences, use a devil's advocate. I want to say a couple of things about using devil's advocate because I hear it get kind of badmouth, but there's also reasons for it getting badmouth. So I think there are some situations where using a devil's advocate can be a really valuable tool. If you have a team that just isn't comfortable or used to disagreeing with each other, assigning someone the role at random, assigning someone the role of being the devil's advocate can help them exercise those muscles, set those new expectations, just get in the habit of disagreeing a little bit, asking questions, pushing back. I think it's also important to note that there are topics out there that are not worthy of a devil's advocate. We don't want to operationalize having a devil's advocate in a conversation about racism or sexism or homophobia or any of those things. So if it is a work team specific topic, I think devil's advocate in the short term can be a really effective tool, especially for a team that's kind of a new thing for them. If I explain that in a way that makes sense, I hope. And if you want to move up to high exchange, some examples of what you do. And I think if you can look at these 4 lists of things and get a sense of what's going on, you can probably start to add some of your own tools or skill sets to that.
Joe, before you move off of this
Yeah.
one, can you go back just for a second?
Yep.
So, at the risk of gilding the lily, this is probably the most important tool that I've learned from you, and I'll tell you why. As facilitators, we use tools like jokes, storytelling, asking questions, devil's advocate, silence in order to move group dynamics, but oftentimes it's a shot in the dark for when and where we actually apply those different methods. What this does is that this actually gives us a prescriptive model to understand why and when you use those things. So Casey, just because you're on the line, one of the things I've heard from you, you are very good at telling a joke. Understanding this model will tell you that when you use a joke, you're moving them from high difference to low difference. You're helping them gel as a group. You can use this model to say, okay, they're feeling stress, they're feeling conflict, they're feeling exhaustion. It's time for a story. It's time for a shared belief. So again, use this model as a prescription for yourself to be able to channel the group dynamic. I can't underscore the importance of this model. It's something that I use all the time, and I learned it from Joe. Thanks for letting me chime in a little bit. I'll take it back over to you.
Yeah, thanks for saying that way better than I did. I appreciate that. And congratulations, Casey, for being a good joke teller. I'm not. I don't have that skill set. People usually don't even know it when I've told a joke, so I can't use that one. But jokes, making people laugh, it's a communal thing. I don't know how to explain it, but it brings people together. There's a warmth and a camaraderie that comes from that. So in the right situation, it can be really fantastic. Any other? Let me just maybe take these down for a
Yeah,
second.
some good stuff in chat, Joe. You might want to check it out.
Yeah. See if anybody has any questions or if. Ooh, there's a lot of stuff in here.
Yeah, and Joe, do me a favor, just speak to what you're reading for the recording, okay?
Oh, yes. Um, Contrarian view intentionally susses out weakness. The juice has to be worth the squeeze. Yeah, I don't think I said that, but that's a line that I use a lot. Uh, Going back to that upper left-hand quadrant, right? The high difference, high exchange. Like, we don't want to fight about where to go to happy hour. We just want to fight about it. We're not trying to be Congress. We don't want to turn everything into a fight, but we need to be able to disagree aggressively on certain things. I think that's pretty important. Yeah, appointing someone the devil's advocate does, at least in the beginning, it provides people some grace. And again, we start to build those muscles and set new expectations. There's a lot of teams that I've worked with that because they've gotten so comfortable without any disagreement that everyone kind of freaks out when it does happen. We need to get to the point where we're freaked out when it doesn't happen. We don't want to fight about everything, but their disagreement should be something that we do on a regular basis. If we're not disagreeing with each other on important things, what that tells me is that there's some people that aren't comfortable telling the truth. And that's a container problem. We got to fix the container, right? I think the way that I think about this work, if I was going to boil it down to its essence, it's about creating spaces and places where human beings, all of whom are different from each other, can tell the truth to each other. I think that's the very heart of this work. Regardless of who I am, and regardless of who you are, if we've joined the same organization, if we've enlisted in the same mission and vision and values, then I should be able to tell you the truth. I should be able to tell you the truth about who I am. I should be able to tell you the truth about my experience in this building. I should be able to tell you the truth about my perspectives on the work that we're doing together. And I think there's more work involved in that than most teams and most leaders understand. And like I said, psychological safety is one of the things that we can get to for
So
that.
Joe, on the topic of truth telling, what do you do if you're stuck in an organization where they're being Nebraska nice to each other?
Yeah, there's a lot of Nebraska nice here, and I think it's called different things in different parts of the country, but it's kind of the culture where we prioritize politeness over honesty, and there's a lot of that in Nebraska. We're incredibly polite, but right below the surface is a whole bunch of unacknowledged stuff. I have a friend who's about my age. a Black woman who moved to Omaha from the South, and I became friends with her in my first couple of years in Omaha, and she shocked me by saying Omaha was the most racist city she'd ever lived in. And she explained that to me by saying, at least in the South, they say it to my face. In Omaha, nobody says it to my face, but I can tell they're all saying it behind my back. I think there's a lot of that, maybe especially in the Midwest, but in corporate workplaces, I think there's a lot of that. Disagreeing with each other sometimes feels personal and different things. So we don't want to get stuck in Nebraska nice. I'm not the anti-politeness person or anti-kindness. I think we could use some kindness in the world, but it's really important that we're able to tell the truth to each other as coworkers. And I especially like to think about those risky truths, like do you have evidence on your team, in your organization, that you can disagree with your supervisor? Do you have proof that it's safe for you to disagree with your boss's boss? Do you have proof that it's safe to ask for help, admit failure, share your big crazy idea, ask the uncomfortable question? Because if those things aren't happening because of the real safety or the perceived safety, then that team and that leader is deprived of some potentially really valuable information. A long, long time ago, I was in the United States Marine Corps, and we talked a lot about the difference between ground truth and headquarters truth. You've got Marines on the ground who are doing their thing, and then you've got generals at headquarters who are doing their thing. And what happens is those two groups of people are oftentimes not operating on the same information. There's a whole bunch of stuff from down here that never makes it up here. Sorry, I should have turned the light on in my office. I didn't know how weird I looked on screen until just now.
You're fine.
There's a whole bunch of stuff from the ground level that never makes it to headquarters. Some of the stuff that gets filtered out fastest, bad news. Why do people stop sharing bad news? They stop sharing bad news because of the way in which they think it's going to be received. So you have leaders who might be the most competent people on the planet. They're not really equipped to make the right decisions for the Marines on the ground because they don't understand their situation. They've lost access to some really valuable information. I think that most organizations today still have straight white middle-aged managers. And I don't think those straight white middle-aged managers have access to the reality of the lived experience of people of color and women in the workplace, because those people have stopped sharing those stories because they've gotten evidence that it's not safe to share those stories. And so that leader might have the best intentions in the world, does not understand the workplace beyond his own single and narrow experience. And I think that happens a lot. And that leader is not equipped to fix things. For you to really understand a workplace or a community, you've got to have relationships with people that are different from you, and those relationships have to be safe places for them to tell the truth. If you have diversity of people in your life and they tell you the truth, you're going to learn things about the world and about your workplace and about yourself that you're not going to learn from people that look like you or just like you. Sorry, I got off on a little bit of a ramble there. Any other questions or comments on any of that stuff? I think I'll dig into some psychological safety stuff. And I apologize if this also is super basic or review for many of you. I won't spend a lot of time on it. Hopefully. Oh my goodness, my screen is doing all kinds of things. None of them are good.
I think you left off with Project Aristotle.
Oops. Okay, are my slides up now?
Your slide sorter is. There you go.
It is? Okay, awesome. So psychological safety has become pretty kind of a common part of the business place lexicon in the past few years, but research on it goes back a long, long time. And I think one of the things that brought it into greater popularity or awareness was a really fantastic full-length article in the New York Times about some research that came out of Google. Google was trying to answer the question, what makes a good team or a smart team? And they had some ideas and some guesses, but they had never collected the data. And Google loves data. So under the name Project Aristotle, they studied this. They tracked almost 200 internal teams. They tracked almost 300 data points on each team. They did focus groups. They did interviews. They collected a mountain of data. And there were 5 things that sorted out of this research that were correlated with team performance at Google. And these are probably all worth paying attention to, but the number one driver is psychological safety, which Google defines as a situation where team members feel safe taking risks and being vulnerable in front of each other. And so I would put this at the very center of this idea of having an inclusive employee experience. right? It has a lot to do with, can I tell the truth here? Regardless of who I am, can I tell the truth here? Can I be true to myself? It's got a lot of other benefits as well, but it's really central to this idea of inclusion. And like I said, there's a lot of research on psychological safety. Some of it goes back 30 and 40 years before it even had a specific name. But there's a lot of research out there on it. If you want to find more research or application, there's a bunch of stuff available. In the kind of more academic literature, the definition is a little bit different than what Google uses, different words at least, but we're still talking about the same thing. There's not going to be any negative consequences for me telling the truth here. And we know we have real clarity on what creates psychological safety. There are these 5 things. These are the causes or the roots or the antecedents of psychological safety, especially the top 2. Role clarity and peer support have the strongest correlation. But the more of these things you have, the more psychological safety you have. And most of my work, when I work with a team or an organization on psychological safety, I almost entirely focused on role clarity and peer support. Do we all know what we're doing and why we're doing it and how we're expected to participate? And are we building relationships with each other? The more of these 5 things we have, the more psychological safety we have. The more psychological safety we have, the more of these things we have. And these are really fantastic things. Inclusion's not even on the list, but we're doing this in the name of inclusion. So there's a lot of benefits to psychological safety. And I think it's kind of intuitive. It's kind of easy to understand. There's some value and some efficiency in having more candid conversations, right? So we don't have to have the conversation after the conversation, the meeting after the meeting, like we do in so many places. I don't think it's hard to convince people of the importance of psychological safety and telling the truth to them. I think we sometimes don't realize how much effort and consistency goes into creating it. It requires more than saying, I want to hear from everyone and I've got an open door policy. Like, it requires some real consistency and some specific practices. A few questions I like to share with teams to just help them think a little bit about psychological safety on the team level. Do we have clear expectations? Are there lots of unwritten rules? Unwritten rules make psychological safety and everything relative to DEI more difficult. And most organizations have a bunch of unwritten rules. Most teams have a bunch of unwritten rules. If you start looking for them in an organization, I think you'll see a lot of them. And unwritten rules, not only do they make things more difficult, but they tend to advantage the most advantaged folks in the workplace and further disadvantage the most disadvantaged work folks. Disagreeing with each other, making decisions with each other is probably one of the most important things that we do as coworkers. It's probably one of the most difficult things that we do as coworkers. There are very few organizations that have any written expectations or written rules for how we make decisions here and how we deal with disagreement. So those meetings are super inconsistent. They're usually driven by the comfort level of the most powerful person in the room. Like, that work is too difficult and too important for us not to have some written agreements or written rules about how to do it. Is it safe to be unpopular? That's probably my favorite question relative to psychological safety. Is it safe to be at least temporarily unpopular on your team? Have you seen evidence? Has it been proven? Because I think in some organizations, we get rid of the unpopular people faster and more efficiently than we get rid of poor performers. If we want people to tell the truth to each other, if we want people to make their full and unique contribution to the workplace, it's got to be safe to be unpopular. If you're unpopular every day, that's maybe a different issue, maybe a different presentation, but it should be safe. It should probably be rewarded for me to be unpopular in this meeting on this topic, on this specific issue. If it's not safe for us to be unpopular, guess what? It doesn't happen. The team and the leader don't hear that information, don't hear that idea, don't benefit from that question. Is it always safe to tell the truth? Do we disagree enough? I don't know what the right answer for that is, but I think it's a valuable question to think about. When we do disagree, do we do it well? Are there things that we do not discuss? I think, first of all, a lot of teams posed with these questions can't even have a conversation about it, which tells you everything that you need to know relative to psychological safety. But if you are able to have a conversation about these, you might be able to kind of easily identify some of your opportunities for improvement. Some simple, basic practices and behaviors that have consistently proven to increase psychological safety. And again, I focus mostly.
Joe, I think you've got a hand up. I'm sorry to interrupt. I just don't want to get too far past it.
Yeah.
Damaris,
Sure.
you want to go?
Yeah.
I was going to share the four layers of psych safety that seem to resonate with managers in my own practice. The four questions being, is it okay for me to be new in an established team? Is it okay for me to have a divergent view? Is it okay to disagree, conflict? And is it okay for me to be a learner, make
Mm,
mistakes, be in error? And simplified into those four questions seems to resonate with management. Easy to
yeah.
understand, easy to demonstrate as happening daily or not happening daily.
Right. Thank you for sharing that. Is that connected to Timothy Clark's work, his model?
Yes,
Okay.
and I've translated it for my own audiences, but essentially it's the four questions that
Yeah.
again, my managers seem to really like the simplicity of that. And it's something that they've seen and can see and look out for. And then there's a
Fantastic.
set of behaviors that you can prescribe to bring more of that safety on those four levels.
Fantastic. Thanks for sharing. And that's a good resource. Timothy Clark wrote a book. I think it's called Four Levels of Psychological Safety, and it's not a super thick book. He also posts quite a bit of information on LinkedIn relative to psychological safety. He's a really good resource. Thanks for sharing that. Is it Damaris? Damaris.
Damorous, like glamorous Damorous.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Um, okay. Your response makes me assume that you've answered that question more than once or twice. I have the opposite problem. I have a super boring name. Thank you for sharing that. Hopefully my slides are back up. Some specific kind of individual level behaviors and practices that I know are effective at increasing psychological safety. Relationship building is a big part of it. And I don't think, people need to be informed that relationships are important. I think they know that. I think in the workplace where we fall down is we don't actually budget time for relationship building, and so it doesn't happen. So I think the key is like helping people set aside time for relationship building, for people on a team to keep building those relationships with each other, for the leader to keep building relationships with them. Soliciting ideas and input. You all, I'm sure, are very, very good at that. I think technology is making it easier and easier for us to provide multiple ways for people to share. I think, we're learning a lot about neurodivergent folks and some of the different needs and modalities there. Just with introverts and extroverts, there's a big difference in like feeling comfortable digging into a conversation in the heat of the moment versus having some time to prepare for it. That's an important part of it as well. Not everybody likes to speak in front of a group. So if you are in a situation where you can provide other opportunities, you can use technology or you can solicit input in advance. I think that's a good thing to think of. I think if you're in a situation where the decision making being involved, I think being transparent in how the decision is made is helpful so that people can maybe see that even if their idea didn't win out, that it was actually considered. Reward disagreement done well. And I'm going to put an emphasis on this. Um, I think you really have to lean into this one. You have to prove that it's safe for people to disagree with you. I think you have to reward them for doing it. And I don't think you have to cut them a bonus check, but it might be something as simple as saying, thank you for that act of courage. You just took a risk on my behalf, on the team's behalf. Thank you for doing that. I think if you do that, if you publicly, consistently reward disagreement done well, the vibe in that group is going to change and you're going to get more of that. I think another example of a tool or a practice is candid emotional check-ins. And I'll share an example of one that I use for some of the standing meetings that I facilitate. It's just a way to quickly share some information with each other, but also to prove that it's safe to tell the truth here, even about gross things like feelings. So the example that I use is I have a couple monthly meetings that I facilitate. At the beginning of our meetings, we do introductions and check-ins, and the format is tell us who you are, tell us what you do, and tell us how you're doing today. But so that we don't spend 45 minutes unpacking how we're doing today, the way that you answer that question is you can either be green, you can be yellow, or you can be red. Green means you're awesome. Yellow means you're not awesome. Red means you're carrying something kind of heavy today. It takes very little time. We prove that it's safe to tell the truth about something that we don't always tell the truth about. And before we wade into this potentially complex conversation, we have some information about where everyone's at today. Like it might be helpful for me to know that the person sitting next to me is read today, that they've got a child going in for surgery and they're not 100% here. That might be a valuable thing for me to know before we wade into this conversations. There's lots of other ways you can do that same exact thing, but it's a simple, quick thing. Again, we proved that it's safe to tell the truth about some stuff that we don't always tell the truth about, and we share some information with each other. If you remember a few slides back, the biggest driver of psychological safety is role clarity. So anything that you can do to give people clear expectations. What are we doing? Why are we doing it? How are we going to do it? How am I expected to participate? I think a lot of times for leaders or facilitators, that's kind of obvious to us, but if we haven't spoken it out loud, it's not nearly as obvious to the other bizarre and different and unique human beings that are in this group with me. I think clarity of expectations, especially around decision-making and disagreement, are really important. I mentioned that before. I think this is one of the biggest gaping holes in most workplace culture. It's really important that we're able to disagree with each other, and there's almost nothing put in place as far as expectations or ground rules or training or any of that. We could dig into a whole big, hairy philosophical conversation about decision-making, dictatorships and democracies and consensus. I'm not going to do any of that tonight, but I will say that regardless of the structure of decision-making, it kind of moves, and this comes from a book that Brian might have turned me on to.
The Sam Kaner one?
Sam Kaner.
There you go.
The title is ridiculous, but Sam Kaner is the man. He wrote the book. That might be where this framework comes from. But in decision-making, I always try to make sure that we're thinking about starting off with divergent thinking, right? We want to fill the space with a bunch of divergent information, a bunch of different ideas. That gets us to the messy middle. We need to have some tools and some practice in place for figuring out how to navigate that. And then we want to move to convergent thinking. We want to leave that decision on the same page. And in my experience, most teams are kind of sloppy on both ends. They don't invite a lot of diversity in on the front end, and they don't always get to a clear shared decision point. We should have some tools or some practices or some agenda in mind for how we move through those phases for decision making and for disagreement. We want disagreement done well. This isn't Mad Max, 2 men enter, 1 man leaves. Like, again, we're not trying to be Congress, but when we need to have disagreement, we need to be able to do it, and we need to be able to do it well without damaging relationships. And some people might not know what that looks like. They might not have ever seen that in their lives. So anything that you can do to put some expectations in place will be helpful there. And it will make them safer to start leaning into that. And maybe you start this simply. And you all are probably much further down the road on this than I am. But this is kind of a basic tool that I share with a lot of managers. Like, sit down and have a conversation with your team about the fact that you're all different human beings. If you tell the truth to each other, which would be awesome, there's naturally going to be some disagreement between us. If we do that disagreement well, it's really valuable. So let's put some agreements in place for how we're going to do it. And maybe you just start by taking out a sheet of paper and drawing a line down the middle. And on one side, let's put ideas of what disagreement done well looks like. And on the other side, let's put examples of what it doesn't look like. Even if you start that simply, that rudimentary, you've had a conversation about it. You may be starting to shape some expectations, and you've got some stuff written down. Hang it on the wall. You can go back and you can reference it and you can edit it, and it becomes a compass or a map for you to navigate increasingly candid conversation. And once you've got some of those agreements in place, start getting your reps in, start disagreeing, and don't pick the biggest, smelliest thing to start with. Like, pick something that doesn't matter at all. Like, fight about cats or dogs, fight about rock and roll versus country. Practice, build those muscles, practice those things. The more you practice disagreeing with each other, the better you're going to get at it. The more comfortable people are going to get at it, the more complex issues you're going to be able to tackle. And I think that's the ability to do disagreement well is a limiting factor on a lot of teams, and I would say a lot of boards and C-suites. And one of the, I think, very effective tools for doing these things are putting ground rules in place, or I usually use the language of agreements. And the key, and I'm probably speaking to the choir here on this, but the key to ground rules is You have to have an accountability plan. Like you have to have a conversation about when we're 3 minutes into the meeting and someone breaks this ground rule, like who's going to do what? Like what's the chain of events that happens after that? That conversation almost never happens. And we keep writing these amazing ground rules down on the flip chart and we don't pay any attention to them. If you put the accountability piece around it, those agreements become very, very powerful. And even though it's just focused on a particular meeting, some of those behavioral norms and expectations are going to ripple outside of that meeting. And we're talking here about things that are very much in alignment with the principles of DEI. So I'm going to share, the last thing that I'll share with you is just a quick example of some ground rules put together by an executive team that I worked with. This goes back 5 or 6 years now. This is an executive team that really liked the idea of psychological safety for their organization, but they thought that they were fine as a team. I wanted to do the assessment with them just so they knew what the assessment was. Their psychological safety scores were actually quite bad. And it pretty much always works out that way. Executive teams are always kind of out of touch with reality when it comes to their own psychological safety. This is a team that has a 90-minute weekly meeting. I think they meet on Monday mornings, and they use their time in kind of an intentional ways. But the only reason I'm sharing this with you is because they end with an opening reflection and they close with a review. And what they do in the opening reflection is they read their agreements out loud. At the beginning of every single meeting, they read these agreements. And at the end of every single meeting, they go back to those agreements and they do a little bit of an accountability check-in. What are some things I can do better next time? What are some things we can do better next time? And they developed these agreements. And the priority for almost all of these agreements was to increase psychological safety. And the reason I'm sharing these particular examples is this is an example where we did an assessment. We had a baseline score for a team. We put these particular agreements in place. And a few months later, like I'm trying to think of the timeline of this, like 3 or 4 months later, their psychological safety score had changed quite a bit on this particular team. Not suggesting these are the right agreements for you or any other organization. They're just examples of agreements that were effective for this particular team. I'm committed to showing up on time, prepared to participate fully. This is a team that makes some decisions together in every single one of these meetings. So you can't walk in and say, I haven't read the email. And to set a very specific expectation, they say you should be willing to spend 1 minute preparing for every 1 minute of meeting time. Clear expectation. Might not be the right one for you. It's been a good one for this team. I'm committed to being physically, mentally, emotionally present in order to make my unique contribution to our work. This one I think kind of sets a tone when it's being read at the beginning of the meeting. And it's a good reminder that if we're going to have honest conversations and do some disagreement well, like we can't just be physically here. We have to be like emotionally and spiritually dialed in and ready to dance. I will strive to communicate assertively, exhibiting both courage and compassion. So this is an organization that has invested pretty heavily in assertive communication. They actually wrote it into job descriptions and performance evaluations for leaders. They were going to do that for everybody. I don't know if that's happened yet or not, but they're trying to invite people. How do I say this? They're trying to invite people to this conversation in a spirit of inquiry rather than in a spirit of advocacy, right? Rather than coming here trying to win the fight, I want to come here and try to help this team find its way to the best decision. And assertive communication is how I do that. Assertive communication is I'm going to try to be courageous. I'm going to try to be as honest as I can, but I also care about the people around the table. I don't want to hurt. I don't want to damage relationships. I want to be able to disagree on information and ideas. I don't want to damage relationships. Courage and compassion. I'm committed to helping the team stay on point. That's not really very much about psychological safety. That's more about the fact that this team was always off in the weeds, off the agenda. They're not anymore. I'm committed to championing decisions of this team as if they were my own. So in addition to putting these agreements together, this team also put together a basic outline or framework for how they were going to make decisions. They did it as a group. And part of the payoff for that was everybody has to own everything that comes out of it. You can't go back to your team anymore and say, let me tell you what these knuckleheads decided up at headquarters. Can't do that anymore. You have to own everything that comes out of it. And no interruptions. And I believe, if I remember correctly, they added no electronics to this. And whether you make it a ground rule or an agreement or not, as a facilitator, I hope you pay very close attention to interruptions. There are very strong gender dynamics behind that at all levels, all the way up to the Supreme Court, and it's a fairly simple thing to fix. So they put these agreements in place and they had some success. Just to share some other tools with you, and I think Brian mentioned a couple of these, kind of an overview of their how they make decisions is they believe in making decisions by consensus. And we had to work through that. That word didn't even mean the same thing to everybody when we started that process. We had to come to kind of a shared understanding of what consensus was. But then there's some specific tools or practices that they use in their decision-making process. One of the things that they always do is they check for assumptions. They look for and challenge assumptions. And I should have put the 3 questions on the slide. I apologize, I didn't. But 3 questions that I share with teams to help them look for and challenge assumptions. When I'm making a decision about somebody or something or a certain situation, the first question I ask myself is, as I start to come to conclusions, do I know this about this person, this place, or this situation, or do I think I know this? Is this a fact, or is this an opinion, a perspective, an interpretation? We're trying to separate. We want to make decisions based as much on fact as possible and use as little as this other stuff as possible. But first, we have to start by sorting. Do I know this, or do I think I know this? The second question is, if I'm saying that I know this, or we're saying that we know this, where's the evidence? Where's the supporting evidence that this is factual? Or was this just said by someone with a really big title? And the third question is, can this evidence be interpreted differently? Do I know this, or do I think I know this? If I'm saying that I know it, what evidence do I have to support it? Can that evidence be interpreted differently? Not only is that good for healthy decision-making, it's also probably one of the most effective ways to check bias, because bias is things that we think we automatically know about people based on what we see and what we hear. So it's a really effective check for bias that they've operationalized into their decision-making process, and it's good for healthy decision-making in general. They do some things to make sure that there's a sufficient amount of dialogue, at least in the beginning. They did use a devil's advocate role for a couple of months, and then they moved on beyond that. There's a practice in some industries known as red teaming, which is kind of the devil's advocate on steroids. Some corporations, some government entities, when they're making really big plans or decisions or strategies, they'll build a team of people whose entire job is to poke holes in that decision or that plan, to make it as reality tested as possible before we get to it. And I think Brian has actually done a little bit more work in that area than I have. Another tool that I really like to make sure that there's sufficient dialogue and that there's a shared understanding is taking the third chair perspective. And the way that this works, and I don't use this in all meetings or for all decisions, but when there's a lot of stuff being shared and when maybe there's starting to get to be some emotional context in the room, it's a good way to pause the conversation and kind of check for clarity or shared understanding. Once there's 2 or more points of view being discussed, what I do is I pause the conversation and I invite Group A to explain Group B's point of view. And I invite Group B to explain Group A's point of view, to see whether or not they actually understand each other. I think a lot of times when we're disagreeing, like, I know how amazing my idea is, and I know that you disagree with it, but my understanding sometimes doesn't go any further than that. Like, do I understand why you disagree with me? Do I understand where the disagreement is at? It slows the conversation down. It cools off emotions if that's needed. It makes sure that we're talking about the same thing and that we've got a shared understanding. And sometimes what happens when you've got more information being shared, instead of choosing plan A or plan B, sometimes what will happen is we see an opportunity to take part of plan A and part of plan B and part of something else and mash them up together and come up with something that none of us could have come up with on our own. For some decision making, that's a pretty good practice. They use a formal call for decision. They also are pretty serious about when a decision is being made, everyone speaks. They use a practice called serial sharing, which means everybody's going to go on the record out loud and everyone has the exact same amount of time. And they use a timer. When you're 3 minutes or 90 seconds or whatever's up, a buzzer goes off. And so they don't have conversations and decisions that are dominated by the same 2 people all the time. They have a very balanced conversation. And they also use the practice, I think Brian mentioned this one earlier, of the person with the most power always speaks last. When we're making decisions or we're doing brainstorming, we want that divergent thinking on the front end. We want as much variety as possible. And we know that as soon as the person with the most power says something out loud, we're going to start to lose some of that. People are going to start to round things down and round things up, and they're going to start to come together. We want to put that off as long as possible. Anytime there's a decision-making or an ideation conversation, I think that's a really good agreement or rule.
Yeah. Joe, you had a question in chat. What is jailbreaking?
Yeah, so jailbreaking was for that agreement about I'm going to help keep my team on the agenda. Jailbreak means that anybody in the meeting, when they feel that we've left the agenda, they can say jailbreak. As soon as they say jailbreak, we write down what's being discussed on the parking lot. We build it into a future meeting agenda. We go back to the point on the agenda. That's what jailbreak is. I think I made that name up. I don't think that comes from anywhere super professional or grounded. I or somebody made that name up, but that's what jailbreak is. Thanks for your question.
I'm dropping in a couple of synonyms, so you could also hear that as Elmo, enough, let's move on. Another one is Geppo, good enough, push on. Thanks, Joe.
Yeah, and those are all good examples of just having words or having tools to help us easily do some things that are difficult to do in the workplace. Even the ability to just name something is helpful. I think especially because there's so many unwritten rules, like, go back to disagreeing with each other. If there's nothing written or spoken out loud about how we disagree with each other, how do I learn how to do that as a new employee? I just have to go to freaking meetings for 9 months or 90 days or 9 weeks or however long it takes for me to learn all of these unwritten rules of the workplace. Like, we could remove all of that inefficiency. You could know on day one how we as a team make decisions and how you're expected to participate. That's a huge saving. That's a huge unlock. And it benefits the team and it benefits the individual experience. When you're the new person and there's a bunch of unwritten rules, that doesn't make you feel like an insider. It makes you feel like an outsider. Why do I never understand things? Why do I have to keep going to people and have things explained to me? It's because we're drowning in unwritten rules. Unwritten rules don't benefit anything. Even if the rule is good, it should be written down. That's when we get to a place where we can have the same expectations for everyone. Sorry, I'm a little bit soapboxy tonight. I apologize. Yeah, let's stop there and just see what you have for comments, questions, complaints.
It's a good group for soapboxing, Joe. I appreciate it.
I hope so. Had some things on my mind lately.
Hey, Joe, I have one question for you.
Yes.
Would you mind just giving me an example? Say one of your ground rules is no interrupting, and then someone interrupts. How do you how would you gently bring them back?
I think it depends a lot. I think there's a lot of ways to do that. It kind of depends on the culture. Like, I've been in some cultures that are pretty rough and tumble, where they use pretty aggressive language with each other, and they don't really have a no interruptions rule, but they do try to manage interruptions. And they've started paying attention to interruptions, especially relative to new people on the team or people that are the only member of their group on a particular team. So I don't think there's one right way to do that. It kind of depends on the culture. One of the ground rules that I really, really like, that is kind of a way of getting at interruptions through kind of the back door, but I set the ground rule of 4 before me, or you could say 3 before me or 5 before me. And that's just a rule that says, once I've weighed in with something, I have to keep my mouth shut and focus on listening until 3 or 4 or 5 other unique human beings have weighed in on this. That's one way, without even talking about interruptions, that you can try to manage interruptions. You can also reward people for when someone does get interrupted, they bring the conversation back to the person that was interrupted. I think there's different ways to do it. Having some conversations about it on a regular basis, talking about the consequences of it on a regular basis, setting it as a ground rule for some teams might be enough. But those are a few options. There's probably some people on this call that have other ideas for that as well. Would you add anything to that, Brian?
I have a little one, if that's okay.
Sure.
And I'll go ahead and share my screen. So this comes from Frederick Laloux and the book Reinventing Organizations. Joe, I think I sent you a copy of that one, didn't I? Yeah, it's a good one. So what they say in order to actually have these ground rules in effect is you really need 3 things. First is a shared understanding of what's healthy. So in the book, they give the example of we don't fly economy. Okay, so that's a shared understanding. That's a written ground rule, as Joe's been talking about. The second thing that you need is information. So that is the minimum data required so that you know if there's a problem, so that it can become quickly apparent. Those of us that are in the DC area, it would not be a revelation to say that I think that the government especially over-indexes on gathering information. That's why we've got so many forms to fill out to do just about anything. So the idea there is just to have the minimum amount of information that you need in order to know when somebody is breaking one of the rules. And I think most important is the third part, which is to have a forum for conversations to trigger self-corrective action. So you have to have the managerial courage and the space to be able to go to Bob and say, Bob, okay, we know you were flying first class. We don't fly first class. We fly economy.
Fantastic. And I think sometimes it needs to be done in one-on-one coaching. Again, I think there's different ways to do it, but yeah, thanks for sharing. What else? What else is top of mind?
Yeah,
I've
like
thrown a
I'm
lot of
running
stuff
into
at you.
this. I'm running into this in a group. Somebody's breaking the ground rule, right? And it's a very large group. There's like 20 people or something like that. And I was able to, kind of do a gentle remind, but also use it as a teaching moment. And then everybody kind of wrote in and like, how can we help? And, this person always does this, breaks this ground rule. And I'm like, I don't want to do any public shaming situation going on here where we all, and I'm like, do we use, it's all a virtual thing. So I'm like, do we use, emoticons? Do we just kind of use reactions? Like, and I can just imagine that would, there's a fine line between this public shaming and also holding the space of like, hey, we decided not to do that. I think your original point, though, in the beginning, when you talk about the accountability of what happens when we do that, people are already like, oh, okay, well, I don't want that to happen. But you've already agreed, okay, this is what we're going to do if somebody doesn't, right? And then everybody knows, all right, this is what happens. And then it doesn't kind of caught them off guard. I think that's really smart.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not suggesting it should be a zero tolerance thing, but there should be consequences. At some point, there has to be consequences. If these are our agreements, if this is what makes us a group, then violating them at some point has to have some kind of consequence. And I think social pressure can be really, really effective sometimes, but taking great care around that shaming piece. I mean, especially relative to DEI. DEI is already accused of being so shaming and so blaming, and some of that is. I think it's been exaggerated a little bit, but we've done some of that. And I don't think there's any positive outcome ever of shame. I think that's a bad one. So sometimes you have to do it in public, but doing it the right way. I have a lot of peers that talk about calling people in instead of calling them out, which is kind of about one-on-one conversations. I've seen situations where we use people's peers to pressure them a little bit. Around some of these norms. I think there's a lot of different approaches, but thanks.
Oh.
One of the
Joe,
things,
I'm sorry, go ahead, Casey.
just Joe, you saying it made me think of something I've done in the past. The groups, especially when the group comes up with the ground rules themselves at the beginning, ask everyone in the group to sign it, and that gives and where you said the idea of how do you call people in, vice call them out. Thanks for mentioning that because it gives me a chance to say, hey, I've noticed something. We seem to have signed this beforehand. How do you want to show up? No, thank you, Joe. Very helpful.
Yeah, another tool that's been really helpful for me that sometimes can help with peers is the phrase, we don't do that here. Like, I'm not blowing it up. I'm not making it a formal thing. Like, we're not going to HR, but I'm sending a message. We don't do that here. Because this is who we claim to be as an organization. These are our values or these are our agreements. It's a simple thing. It doesn't always work, but it's another example of something that in some situations can be really effective.
I like the way you say that, Joe. It's like these are the things we are not doing today.
Right.
Oh, fabulous.
And the interrupting and the dominating the conversation, like there are some folks that like I don't think they've ever been told no anything in their life, and it's a hard one to get through. And I think different people have different levels. Sometimes people need to hear from people they care about what it feels like to be the person that gets interrupted all the time. Like sometimes people need to see studies about how it even happens at the Supreme Court. I think they've convinced themselves there's no real consequences and they're just being assertive or aggressive or a leader or manly. Sorry, I'm soapboxy again. Sometimes they just don't know some of those other things. Sometimes they do and don't care.
Yeah, very much so.
Complicated and amazing.
I think there was just a more perfect podcast on exactly that, on interrupting at the Supreme Court and who was doing it and why they were doing that, if you want to check that out. And one of the things that I found that honors people's contribution without shaming when they tend to be dominating the conversations, to say something like, Bob, you're carrying a lot of the weight of the team here. I'd like to give others a chance to also carry the load. Joe, just in terms of format, are we at the end of your presentation? Are we into Q&A or do you have more to do? Okay. So let's do this. If there are any burning questions, let's go ahead and ask Joe. But I'm going to move to close. We'll go off the air and then we will move into the Nova Scribes after party. So any burning questions for Joe? Anything unresolved? Camille, you got something?
Just burning question. Joe is presenting for us on June 10th for HRCI and HR Insider. Will this be the presentation? Because this is so awesome and right and exactly right what we do.
Well, thank you for that. I don't know. I'm just completely drawn a blank on what the plan for that meeting is. I know it's coming up, but
it's going to be a webinar for HR professionals. HRCI does certifications, and it'll be about 3,000, sometimes 3,000.
Yeah, I think in June.
HR professionals. June 10th we have it scheduled for. So it's a long way out, but this presentation is perfect for exactly what we do and perfect for HR professionals. And
HR is in a weird place right now.
Weird place. Love to hear it. Yeah, this is is though. Thank you.
Lots of conversations there. Some of it will be for sure. I don't think I've got that presentation done. Some of the language stuff will be in it for sure.
As long as we're plugging other events, thanks for kicking that one off, Camille. So Joe did mention red teaming. So as it so happens, we are doing a Nova Scribes presentation on red team facilitation next Wednesday. That's February 4th. I just dropped the link into chat. Same as this, it's free to attend. We just asked for donations while you're there. Joe, thank you very much for sending your email. And everybody, let's give Joe a big Nova Scribes. Thank you very much. Joe, it's great to have you here. Yay.
Thank you. I hope this was of value to everyone. Enjoy your evening.